Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Lewis Hamilton needs a big weekend this time out in Montreal, but it doesn't seem Ferrari are especially willing to give it to him. Some upgrades that they thought they had planned for this weekend have now been postponed a little bit longer. No new floor, no new rear suspension. This is a circuit where Ferrari have struggled heavily in the ground effect era so far. Hamilton though loves it, but those two things can't necessarily go together, especially now Ferrari are reportedly switching basically all their focus to 2026 and beyond. Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into today, starting with Lance Stroll. We might as well do it because this weekend Lance Stroll is going to be back on the grid. We thought that it might not happen at all because, of course, he didn't race in Spain. He broke his wrist before the 2023 Bahrain Grand Prix a couple of seasons ago. The feeling is that from the very, rapid-fire recovery that he had, let's say, from the injury that he suffered, he fell off his bike, he broke his wrist, he then raced like a week later after some last-minute surgery. That was very impressive, but maybe in hindsight it was a bit of an error because a couple of years later he's had this issue with his wrist again. There are rumours that he was, going around his garage smashing things up and swearing at engineers. I don't know if that was actually true or not. Of course, it was denied by the team, but there was clearly some frustration after he realised, Stroll, after qualifying in Spain, that he was simply in too much pain to actually do the Grand Prix. They had to withdraw the car because Drugovich or nobody else had qualified. They weren't able to put anyone else in the other car. And it was my feeling and many others' feelings that, maybe bringing him back from Montreal would be a bit too much. He's had, again, corrective surgery. And you got to wonder whether his wrist is going to be fully healed from that a couple of weekends later. The difficult thing is, of course, it is the Canadian Grand Prix. It's his home Grand Prix. He's going to want to race here, and kind of difficult not to. Now, if Drugovich was called up, he would have gone. He would have ignored Le Mans and come and done this instead. But Stroll confirms he's going to be back. I'm excited to get back behind the wheel of my team for the home Grand Prix this weekend. I was always going to fight hard to be ready to race in front of the Montreal crowd. Feeling good after my procedure. Put some laps in at Paul Ricard this week to prepare. So he actually was doing some testing at Paul Ricard to, prove to himself that he was capable of doing so. And there is, I think, a grandstand called the Lance Stroll Grandstand here. So, we'll see how it goes from this weekend. Obviously wishing the best, but it's, maybe surprised that he's back. Hopefully a pleasant surprise for him and for the team, but obviously it is still going to be something of a concern given what's happened back in Spain. The other update for you all is on the F175 launch event. You'll remember at the start of the season at the O2 Arena, they did this big event. It was all glam, and to be fair, some of it was okay, some of it was less than okay. But they revealed all the cars. Now, they've confirmed, or at least it's been rumoured, but it's basically been confirmed that for 2026, they're not going to be doing this anymore. They're going to potentially bring it back at some point. But next season, there are lots of different reasons why this isn't going to happen. So apparently Formula 1 has told PlanetF1.com about this. F1 haven't done like an official announcement to say, hey, we're not doing it again. But I guess why would they? But they have spoken to the media, it seems, and informed certain parties that, there won't be a season launch next year. This is for a couple of reasons. Not because it didn't go to plan. I think, as you might expect, they're actually quite happy with how it was received. And I think even from a fan's perspective, the idea of having all the cars unveiled at the same time, one big event, isn't the worst idea ever. I didn't hate the idea of having a livery launch every few days for a couple of weeks in February. But lots of the teams just took the mick, didn't they? They did their own launch. They didn't really show anything anyway. I understand why they tried to get away from that. But in 2026, basically, there's other things to think about. They've got to get the car ready early because testing is going to be potentially very early. They even talk about the cars are going to have to be ready by mid-January to do some testing. Because the cars are going to be fundamentally very different, they're not going to want to walk out their new cars on the stage for the event. What often happens is, at least in the F175 launch event this year, they would roll out last year's car with the new livery on. But they can't do that for 2026 because the cars are going to be nowhere near the same. And what are they going to do? Roll out a launch car that's just the same for every team? Or are they going to roll out a car without the sponsor deals that maybe still need to be signed at that point? So there's just talk here that there's a few reasons why for 2026, especially the magnitude of the change and all the things the teams are dealing with, this is going to be a bit too much. And of course, it wasn't especially well received by the drivers either. And let's not forget the boos, right, for Max and for Horner and for Red Bull at times. And that, raised serious questions on whether Max would ever even go to it if it was in England again. So there was all sorts of drama about that event. But let's go to Montreal this weekend. This is not the prettiest graphic I've ever seen, but it is nonetheless a graphic. Hard, medium, soft for the weekends are the softest compounds on offer. That could have big implications. The general feeling is, I've said this a few times, and over the last few Grand Prix, I'd say this is kind of held to be true. Although the front wing changes may see some differences to this over time. But the harder compounds, what's more important to keep them in the right window is the core temperature, whereas for the softer compounds, what's more important is the surface temperature in general. And the McLaren is incredibly good at controlling the core temperatures. There's been loads of rumours, hasn't there, what they might be doing to achieve that advantage. Controlling the core temp is less necessary, let's say, on the softer compounds. So there is an argument that their advantage will somewhat reduce. Now, in Monaco, we saw them use the softest of all the compounds. Like Imola, for example, they had very soft compounds as well. Max won that time out and was very fast. Monaco, they obviously won the Grand Prix in the end, but, Leclerc, Ferrari was still very competitive. And the Red Bull has other issues around circuits like that. So I think this weekend is going to be quite telling to see, okay, is the McLaren still just much faster? Can Max be very close? Where are Mercedes going to be? Because Mercedes should be this weekend really the team to watch. Outside of Max and the McLarens, it should be Mercedes, because McLaren obviously will be the favourites, but Ferrari have struggled heavily around here, and George Russell stuck in a pole position last year, let's not forget. And Mercedes also have some upgrades in the works, which Ferrari most certainly do not. There was some follow-up drama from Derek Warwick, of course, controversial steward for many comments over the years, as you guys do not hesitate to point out. But he made his thoughts on Hamilton and said that I think he deserves the 8th title. Now, of course, deserving is, doesn't really exist. Either you earn it or you don't. But the point is that Derek Warwick, despite being a very controversial steward for a few different reasons, is once again giving his perspective on drivers to the media. And whether that should be fair or not for a steward to do is a bit of a question mark. Now, speaking of Mercedes, Russell Hamilton, Russell even commented on his own future at Mercedes, because he's not guaranteed to come back next year. It's very likely, but, many people would still argue that if Max Verstappen offers his services to Toto Wolff, he's not going to deny him. And Antonelli's not going anywhere for sure. Russell says, nothing is safe, nothing is certain, but if I stay with Mercedes, next year will be my 5th year with the team, which, to be fair, is quite a lot to stay with a single team. And not to say that he's going to leave anytime soon, because I'm not sure that it would make much sense, but as he says, nobody knows when their time will come. And who knows, maybe Mercedes have a great engine next year, but they don't put it all together. They don't put, once again, the package around it, as we have seen them struggle with in the Grand Effect era so far since 2022. That may not necessarily change. This is Arvid Lindblad, potential Red Bull driver in the future. He got his super license exemption. Thought it was quite cool. He answered a couple of questions here. His first question was, who's your motorsport hero? He said Lewis Hamilton, which makes perfect sense for a driver, British driver of his age. I think he's got Swedish blood. I think he's got Indian blood as well. But he says Hamilton. But then he was asked the question, what celebrity would you like to drive with as a teammate? And he said Max. So he managed to tick both boxes very successfully there. So good PR training early on, I think, from Lindblad. But he could get a drive if Max gets a ban. Now, it's also worth keeping in mind, if Max gets 1 penalty point in the next 2 Grand Prix, then he gets a ban. But also, he needs to get 3, or he needs to not get 3 before October. That's maybe the more likely idea, is that the next couple of Grand Prix, is he going to get 1? Maybe not, probably not. But is he going to get 3 before October? Possibly, right? Now, just to look at what we have seen penalty points given for. Largely, it's causing a collision, right? We've seen this plenty of times. Forcing a rival off the track, speeding under a yellow flag, overtaken under a red flag, of course we've seen that recently, falling too far behind under the safety car, speeding under the VSC, and then driving unnecessarily slowly in qualifying. I will say, though, over the last couple of years, it was certainly true for Gasly, and I would argue it was true for Magnussen as well for some time, that maybe the stewards were more lenient than they could or should have been in certain instances because they didn't want a race ban to happen. And look, the FIA, if the rule is X and driver violates the rule, they should do Y. But we're not sure that always happens, right? And the idea of giving out penalty points is kind of subjective. For example, Max's collision with Russell back in Spain, he got 3 penalty points for that, which is more than a usual 10-second incident would get. It would get you probably 2. We've seen that before. That may tell you something about the nature of the incident, but also it's kind of at the steward's discretion. If they decide Max does something wrong and they say, well, we don't think that he deserves a penalty point for this one, that's sometimes just how it is. And we know that Max is 49 points behind in the championship, but are they going to be eager, the stewards, to give Max a race ban? They're absolutely not, I don't think. And that shouldn't matter. But I think, based on what we've seen in Formula 1 over the last couple of years, it probably does matter to their decision-making at the end of the day. So maybe I need to revise my estimate of Max's chances of getting a race ban from 25% slightly further down. But let's talk Montreal and who's going to win. Of course, Piastri is going to go in as the favourite, as are the McLarens. The weather is looking relatively clear for the time being, but things could rather swiftly change. Now, Ferrari and all the other teams are thinking a lot about what they do going forwards. There was a rumour today that all of the top teams, excluding kind of Mercedes really, Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, keeping their focus well and truly locked in to some degree on 2025 because, championships are to be won. Now, that is certainly true for Red Bull and McLaren. For Ferrari, that is much less true. Let's be realistic here. The chances of Ferrari winning either of the titles this year are probably 0.05%. It's not high. And none of them have fully switched the focus yet. Mercedes might be getting smart with it, but they do have upgrades in the pipeline. However, other sources have said that effectively at Ferrari, things have changed over the last few days, and they are now almost entirely directing their energy towards 2026. Major updates for the SF25 have reportedly been scaled back, and we'll see some evidence of that in a second, that it doesn't seem they're going to be as gung-ho on 25 as we thought that they might be, which maybe is a good thing for the long term of Ferrari, but it's still, concerning for the immediate term. The wind tunnel phase of the current project, codenamed 677, is nearing completion. Full focus will switch to the 2026 car within June. So that's the reports. Ferrari, maybe under Lewis Hamilton's suggestions, because he said that he would do this, have effectively told their drivers, okay, this is it, right? We've got a couple more things in the pipeline. That's it for the season. We're going to fully focus on next year, and probably they would be smart to do so. De Kessler and the guys at Auto Racer, they did put out the article here where they said that lower temperatures than the torrid Barcelona, where the ignition and the windowing of the tyres on a single lap remains the fundamental theme in the simulator. So, potentially an issue again for Ferrari to deal with in Montreal. Ferrari will return to using the V-shape rear wing configuration with the elevation or the evaluation of the slightly trimmed configuration on the mobile flap that they ran in both Saudi Arabia and Italy. In this regard, no significant updates are planned for the SF25. So this is kind of the V-shape, by the way, where they cut the little top element off the rear wing. They're going to try something like that, it seems, again for this weekend. But there's no major upgrades. There was thought about bringing new upgrades here. There was talk about a new floor. There was talk about the rear suspension, whether they were going to try and fast track it, because rumour had it that the new rear suspension, which is maybe going to turn around the fortunes of the season, was planned for Silverstone. They could potentially have tried to really fast track that upgrade here to Canada, but they're not going to do so. And it seems that the work in Maranello for Canada has been aimed at getting the correct setup, which, let's be honest, they've talked about since the start of the season. I will say it's a bit more relevant now because they've just changed the dynamic of the front wings. So finding the right setup again potentially is a bit more of a challenge, and they're going to have to do a good job finding that again. But Ferrari are not bringing the upgrades we thought that they might. They had some things in the pipeline, but they're going to delay them to further events. And, there was talk from articles over the last couple of weeks that Ferrari are introducing or planning to introduce new floor, new rear suspension at Canada. And even as Maranello, they've branded the car a bad car, and they're expecting the upgrades to improve. They're expecting it to improve it, but they're not expecting it to entirely turn it around. And seems like no upgrades for Ferrari this weekend. So it's a difficult time for the team from top to bottom. We know that it's not been a good track for Ferrari in the Grand Effect era either. It has been Lewis Hamilton's, maybe his best track ever. Of course, the scene of his first Grand Prix victory way back in 2007, mid on pole here, won here so many times. And it's a track that he always tends to go well at and finishes top 5 bare minimum, usually podium bare minimum. But the thing is, Ferrari, they don't really work like that around this circuit, and especially with no upgrades to work on. Now, look, the reasons for Ferrari delaying them maybe twofold. There's some risk. You try and fast track the upgrades. It costs you a lot of money to make that happen if you want to make it happen earlier. If you break it, like let's say you run in qualifying with a certain upgrade, you clip the wall, you have only got one version of it, then you've got to change the version. That means you've got to start from the back of the grid, your broken parc fermé conditions. So there is a risk involved. There's obviously risk in transporting it all this way. The only reason why you would really push it is if you felt very confident that this would be a difference maker in the championship hunt. They may now realize, okay, in all likelihood, we ain't winning the title, so might as well just, we've got the upgrades, we'll bring them when they're kind of about to be ready, we'll learn what we can from them, and then we'll switch our focus to 2026, which I think is probably the smart move for Ferrari, really. But it's just worthy to note that they've had such a bad time here the last few years. In 2022, Sainz ended up, he started third. Leclerc was right at the back of the grid with a failure. 2022 and 2023, even with good cars in qualifying, and last year was maybe a slightly worse quali car but a better race car, the SF24, they ended 10th, 11th, 11th, 12th, Leclerc and Sainz. So it's not a track. It's one of the only tracks really that they've not had a front row start over the last few years, and it's not been a great circuit for them at all. The upside, I suppose, maybe is on the Mercedes side. If we are going to see an interesting fight at the front of the grid, because we've seen Mercedes bring some upgrades at times kind of controversially. You guys might remember when they brought that rear floor stay a couple of years ago. And there was some drama as to how they knew that they were going to be able to use it there, and there was some politics. But they've brought some successful upgrades to Mercedes at Montreal over the last few years. And Mercedes confirmed a little while ago they will have new parts on the car. So Mercedes are bringing upgrades. As we've seen with the talk about Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, they may be very close to Mercedes' real last push. But if there is going to be a team, if Mercedes can achieve more of what they did at the start of the season, this is the type of weekend where you would expect it. Russell was on pole here last year just ahead of Max Verstappen, or the same time as Max, but he set the time slightly earlier. It's a circuit where Mercedes have gone well historically, and it should be a bit of a return to form, I would say, for Mercedes. Given what we have seen recently, the very difficult triple header, there was talk about how they messed up the setup in Imola and Monaco in many respects, and they think they're going to get on top of that here for Spain. Or for Canada, obviously, after, again, a pretty difficult time in Spain, but the hot temperatures, again, made their tyres struggle. Shouldn't be as much of an issue in Montreal. So I think the team to watch is probably Mercedes. Ferrari, I'm not expecting much from, but of course, as we've said, Hamilton does historically go very well around here, so it could be a different story. And who knows, we could get a rather chaotic Grand Prix. That certainly happened here in the past. The championship fight is very much still alive. Whether it's a fight with Max is a bit of a question. Thought it was interesting just to see Lando Norris's current championship deficit. He was 7 points ahead after Australia. He maxed that out to 8 points ahead after China. But since Saudi Arabia, of course, after, what happened in qualifying, it's gone the other way. But he's done a reasonable job controlling it and bringing it back over the last couple of rounds. But Lando will need to, I would say, kick on this weekend, because if Piastri comes in, dominates another Grand Prix weekends, it's going to be difficult for Lando to get in the right headspace to turn the season around. But very much into your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.